We currently incarcerate more people in the United States than any other industrial country, and there are gross racial disparities in terms of who's incarcerated in our country. And in many ways, this era of mass incarceration has amounted to a war on youth and youth of color, specifically black males and Latino males in this country. Our program is also responding to an era of austerity in the cutting of services and an attack on the public sector, whether that's an attack on unions, attack on funding for public sector jobs, which has great impact on communities of color. Our program is also responding to living in this neoliberal era, and with the deindustrialization of the United States, the breakdown of our manufacturing base, and the move from an industrial manufacturing economy to either a high-tech, high-skill economy or a service sector economy and low-skill job economy, low-skill wages and low wages. We're also responding to an era of endless war and the implications, especially on youth of color, and communities of color, whether that's around just the culture of violence that's manifested throughout our society, as well as the amount of money we're spending, again, on war versus human needs. And then lastly, the environment that we're responding to is the election of our first black president and the emergence of a neo-Confederate right-wing political agenda. So within that social political environment, our program has tried to devise projects and organizing projects that can respond in the best way we know how to this environment. So what I'd like to do is just really kind of lay out kind of our philosophical approach to the work and talk about some of our specific projects. Philosophically, we tried to ground our work first in Kingian principles of nonviolence. Specifically, we believe that it's not enough for us to organize just to get victories, if you will, but it's very important that we also do work to transform our opponents. We believe that it's important that we see the humanity in everyone that we're working with, and we understand that living in this culture of endless war and violence that we see across our communities, whether that's the gun violence that we see, the violence of poverty, the violence of racism, we know that violence begets more violence. And so we're really trying to ground the folks that are working with our program in understanding a Kingian approach to community organizing, a Kingian understanding of nonviolence. We also incorporate anti-racist principles that stem from our organizing collaboration with an organization called the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. And we've had a rich relationship. It's probably our primary relationship in our program in terms of working with other organizations in the region, in the Northwest region. And just to lift up some of the undoing racism principles, we believe first and foremost that for us to work to address, again, institutional, systemic, and structural racism, we have to have a working understanding of the historical construction of race and racism in the United States and how race and racism plays out, again, on an institutional level, systemic level, and structural level. We have to understand the intimate connection between race and poverty in the United States, and that you cannot talk about poverty without understanding racism. You cannot understand poverty in the United States without understanding racism. We think it's important that we have accountability. And that means that often when there's, especially in this nonprofit industrial complex that we're all a part of, often we do a lot of work that's in many ways not connected to the needs of community. So it's important for us that we find mechanisms where we have authentic relationship with the young people that we work with the communities, their families, and then the broader community, and really make sure that our programming is in line with the direction and the needs of community. And I've heard it said before that any relationship, whether that's a personal relationship, professional relationship, but any relationship without accountability has the potential to be an abusive relationship. So we really try to ground the work that we do in the spirit of accountability and understanding that I have my job, Marcel Purnell, who's my colleague, has his job because oppression exists in our community. And really all of us in AFSC, we would not be here doing the work that we do if there wasn't oppression. So in many ways, we pay our mortgages, we send our children to college off the backs of oppression, but in many ways, we don't have that authentic line of accountability to communities that we speak for, write grants for, get funding from. So we really try to ground our work in accountability. And just the last principle, and there's more principles that I could lift up, but for the sake of time, the last principle is the principle of leadership development. And we understand that often in social change work, community organizing, activism, that we can become very issue focused. And we know that we need to deal with issues. Issues are important, but more than the issue, we need to focus on developing new leadership because we understand that when we talk about racism in this country, we're talking about 500 plus years of racism. There's not going to be a quick fix. So we need to be working to develop leaders that will move on and take their rightful place, not only in organizations like AFSC, but working in different institutions that will carry an anti-racist analysis into that work. And if we, looking back at the civil rights movement, if we think about the death of Dr. King and how that really, in many ways, killed the civil rights movement because everything was centered around one charismatic leader. So we're really trying to move away from the notion of having one superstar leader and helping everyone to see that they have not only leadership ability, but leadership responsibility. So more than any issue that we're dealing with, we always try to lift up the notion of developing new leaders for the long-term struggle that we're engaged in. So our flagship project is the Tyree Scott Freedom School. And the Tyree Scott Freedom School, in many ways, is based off of the freedom schools that took place in 1964 during Freedom Summer, during the Civil Rights Movement. And folks remember when many young people went to Mississippi and taught African American literacy, voting rights, and really around organizing. So our Freedom School really comes out of that spirit. And our Freedom School has been modeled off of freedom schools that we saw that took place in New Orleans, again, with the People's Institute network. So we went down to a national gathering, myself and Katie Weplow, who was a staff member at the time with my program. We went down to Mississippi for a national gathering of the People's Institute, and we witnessed the Freedom School that was taking place there, and we decided we wanted to come back to Seattle and do a Freedom School in Seattle. So our first Freedom School took place in 2001, and since then, this winter will be our 26th Freedom School. So we do Freedom Schools in the summer for 10 days, and we do mini Freedom Schools in the winter for 3 days. We do it primarily during winter break, and we only are able to do 3 days. Of course, we want young people to be able to enjoy their families and spend time with their families. We've also done Freedom Schools in partnership with Edmonds Community College, which is just north of Seattle in Snohomish County, and we were able to do Freedom Schools with them for 4 years. So that kind of makes up the totality of the 26 Freedom Schools that we've done. At Freedom School, we typically have 35 to 40 young people that attend Freedom School. We'd probably say 90% are youth of color. The age range is typically 16 to 21. And we've been lucky in many ways. We don't have to do a lot of outreach anymore. Freedom School has kind of developed its own brand in the Northwest. So there's a lot of word of mouth that gets passed down. People are emailing and calling us throughout the year saying that they want to either get their children into Freedom School, or they themselves are young people and they want to get into Freedom School. So we almost always have more students apply than we can feasibly take. Now, we say we typically have 35 to 40 students, but there's times when we have 50, 60 people in the room because we have alumni who come back, and we never, even though we have to sometimes turn some students away, it's always hard to say no because we want every young person to get this analysis. So in Freedom School, we explore how we are all conditioned and socialized, what are the messages that we've been given about our place, our worth in society, and really try to help young people to understand that we're all a product of conditioning, whether that's through the media, through our religious affiliations, from our family, and that none of us really see the world as it really is. We all see the world from a product of our experiences. And then we move on to looking at poverty. And we really do an exercise that helps us look at the kind of systemic nature of poverty. Why are people poor from a systemic perspective? Then we look at the kind of blame the individual. And, the things that different people say, whether, poor people are lazy or they're gaming the system or they're having too many babies and, all those things that we say. And then we kind of do a juxtaposition exercise, really looking at where are we coming from as a society around poverty? Where are most of our programs coming from as a society around poverty? Whether that's government policies or even nonprofit social services. Are we about eradicating poverty, or are we about keeping people comfortable in poverty? Are we about looking at the root causes of poverty, or are we about blaming poor people for being poor? And really, it's for the young people to understand, again, how they've been socialized around poverty. Because again, many of them are coming from poor families, poor communities. What have they internalized around why they are poor? And then for them to begin to understand that their communities are not poor because something is wrong with the people in the community, but there are institutional and systemic reasons that are impacting why their communities look the way they look, why their families are experiencing poverty in the way they're experiencing poverty. Then we take them through an exercise looking at a power analysis and really looking at how systems and institutions, through their policies and practices, help to keep communities poor, no matter who's president, who's governor, who's mayor. Certain communities in this country, whether they're poor white communities, poor Latino communities, poor Native communities, poor Black, poor Asian communities. Why do certain communities in this country look the way they look? And really help them begin to do institutional analysis. And then they spend time really breaking down different institutions and looking at how might the education system, for example, be a foot of oppression on poor communities? How might the criminal justice system be a foot of oppression on poor communities? Then we help them to really make that structural connection and see how all these institutions work together. We take them through looking at the historical concept of redlining and how redlining existed, and how even though redlining has been made to be illegal, we still have very much de facto redlining taking place. Then we spend a lot of time really looking at the historical construction of race and racism in the United States, and really looking at the different laws that have taken place and how race and racism has been legalized within the United States. And then we share with them what is called our working, organizing definition of racism. Because we understand that essentially in our society, just like if we went around this room right now and asked everyone in this room, what is racism? We would probably have, if we have 20 people in the room, we might have 20 different definitions. So if we're coming together to solve a collective problem, it is not helpful for us to have 20 different definitions, because we're often talking very different language. So I might say to Renata, ask Renata what is racism, and she might say racism is hatred, for example. If I ask Hector what is racism, Hector might say it's systemic construction and legalized. So really, those are two very different concepts. So we think it's important to have a collective definition of racism. Then we spend time really looking at the internalization of racism, both the internalization of racial inferiority that impacts all people of color, then the internalization of racial superiority that impacts all white people. And that really, again, connects to that socialization piece. What are the messages that we receive as people of color about our worth in this society? Messages that we receive every single day from the institutions that we interact with. And then what were the messages that white people receive, or that white people do receive every single day from the institutions that they interact with? And how does that internalization come together in ways that does not allow us to organize in a healthy way multiculturally? And how are those dynamics playing out every day when we come together across racial lines in ways that create deep pathology, and developing mechanisms to really kind of analyze where internalized oppression might be playing out for us, both individually as well as collectively. And then we spend a lot of time really taking the young people on different field trips. I mean, we have in Seattle what is called a toxic tour, so looking at an area of Seattle that's the neighborhood's called South Park, but has had a rich history of pollutants and toxins being released in the community. It's where the Duwamish River runs through, and the Duwamish people are the indigenous people of that area of the country. And so the Duwamish River, for example, sustained the Duwamish people for thousands of years, but because of pollutants released into the Duwamish River, they would say even if the river was completely dredged, that people could not eat fish out of that river for another 1,000 years. We take people to El Centro de la Raza, which is a Latino-based organization that was taken over in the early 70s by the Latino community and served as a center for the community, not just the Latino community, even though it focuses on Latino community, but a lot of powerful community organizing has come out of El Centro de la Raza. We do what is called a courthouse tour, where we have some of our progressive attorneys in town really take young people through looking at the criminal justice system and really discussing with them the ways in which they see oppression and racism play out within the criminal justice system. And there's a lot of other field trips we do, really trying to take the theory into a different realm for them to really see how these things play out in real life, real time. And also to expose them to environments that many of them have never been in, at least in a way that wasn't adversarial. Some of them have, of course, experienced the courtroom when they were maybe a defendant, but they never really had an opportunity to hear from attorneys or judges who have consciousness around oppression within those systems. And so out of the Freedom School experience, we have a group called Youth Undoing Institutional Racism, which is really the praxis vehicle for young people who want to continue to organize post-Freedom School. Youth Undoing Racism meets from October to June every week. We have roughly 8 to 10 interns that are paid through AFSC. Then we have other students that come on a weekly basis. And we spend time really going deeper into the issues that we explore at Freedom School. So this year, Marcel Purnell is our YUIR, which is the acronym for Youth Undoing Institutional Racism. Marcel Purnell is our coordinator. So he has taken them this year through looking at a history of community organizing in the United States. So looking at the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, looking at the American Indian Movement, looking at different organizing efforts that have taken place in the Pacific Northwest. And so looking at them historically through lectures, videos, different speakers coming in, and then helping the young people to learn from those lessons of the organizing that has taken place before, so they can enhance the organizing that they're doing right now. Bless you.
Thank you.
We're looking at looking deeply at capitalism, looking at the most recent housing crisis, and looking specifically at subprime lending and how that has impacted their community. We're looking at neoliberalism. We're looking at the issues around food justice and food deserts in our community. We're going to have folks come in and talk about organizing around the food workers issues, the folks who are working in the fast food industry, working for living wage jobs. So really just trying to give them a broad-based understanding of the different social justice issues that are playing out, impacting their community. And then we create vehicles for them to take action around issues of concern to them. And our specific focus has been really looking at juvenile justice and the racial disproportionality in terms of juveniles that are incarcerated in King County, Martin Luther King County, and looking at kind of under this broad banner of jobs, education, and ending mass incarceration. So one of the vehicles for the young people to do organizing is a project that we call EPIC, which stands for In the Prison and Industrial Complex, which of course is a huge, huge endeavor. But our focus has been around the current proposal in King County to build a new $210 million, 154-bed juvenile detention center. Now the background around this is our current daily bed count in King County is 70. So on any given day, we're going to have roughly 70 young people incarcerated. The county has released statistics, as well as the Seattle Police Department, that juvenile crime has gone down 11% in King County. However, the county is talking about spending $210 million to build what they're calling a family youth and justice center, which is a very cute name for a jail, and going to build 154 beds. So if we all thought in this room, if we were business owners and we had a hotel and on any given day we're averaging 70 customers in our hotel, would it make any sense for us to build 154 new beds? And if we were going to build a new hotel with 154 new beds, what does that tell us if we're business folks? That we're going to have to put some people in those beds. So we're seeing a direct correlation with the passing of some more draconian, harsh laws as it relates to young people. So our stance is that it is it is a wrong investment to spend this money to lock up more young people, that we should be spending this money on the front end to keep our young people out of this system. In Seattle, in King County, African American youth make up 8% of the county, but are over 42% of those who are locked up in our juvenile justice system. So we want to spend money in addressing, again, the root causes of why young people are incarcerated. So we're putting forward what we're calling an alternative plan and really looking at restorative justice, really looking at enhanced training for all folks who are working with juveniles, whether that's probation officers, juvenile correction officers, police officers, around brain development, the impact of primary and secondary trauma, so they could have a better understanding of young people and young people's response to their authority, often that leads to many arrests. We're working to advocate for a creation of what is called a reception center. And so a reception center is kind of a midway point in between incarceration and doing nothing. And the best example of a reception center that we have seen in the country is in Multnomah County in Portland. And so instead of having to put young people in jail, we believe that young people can be taken to a reception center where they will receive wraparound services and address some of their core needs. We're looking at advocating, our alternative plan includes advocating for more development of more culturally relevant drug treatment centers. Because as it stands right now, in Seattle, in the juvenile system, we have a drug court, but there's racial disproportionality in terms of what youth are referred to drug court by the probation officers. And then when youth of color are sent into drug treatment centers, often they are dealt with by folks that are not from their cultural background, do not understand the young people's experience in dealing with race and racism, systemic poverty, and all the issues that impact their community. And often those young people are kicked out for behavioral reasons. And our belief is that they're kicked out because they're in a place that's really foreign to them, alien to them, and they don't have folks that can relate to them in that environment. So we're saying that we need to enhance drug treatment and enhance culturally relevant drug treatment. And we have a couple other different ideas that we believe that can really serve to knock down the overall numbers. So that number of 70, we believe that, well, let me say, we don't believe that any young person should be locked up. But if you had to take the most egregious crimes, the most violent crime, and said that, you know, some people may just need to be away for a time, we believe that it's roughly around 5 to 10 young people. And so there is no justification for spending $210 million to build a 154 new bed center. So we're really focusing on organizing around that issue. We are scheduled to do a pretty big rally in December, and that's going to lead into a series of living room conversations, hopefully across the city, and then a community forum where we're going to invite elected officials really to hear our alternative plan and really to respond to our alternative plan, as well as we're going to be kind of using our social network to really bombard the elected officials with emails, calls. And so that's kind of the basis of our organizing strategy at this point. Hopefully we'll be able to come back and share with you our success and, you know, additional strategies that we're using to kind of move this issue. Our young people in YUIR are also involved with what is called the Mayor's Race and Social Justice Roundtable. So the city of Seattle has what is called a Race and Social Justice Initiative. And the idea of the roundtable is to bring different organizations together to work collaboratively to address racism. And the kind of primary focus at this point has been around school discipline. I don't know if folks are familiar, but the Department of Justice investigated the Seattle School District around racial disproportionality in terms of discipline rates of African Americans primarily, but also Latinos and Samoans in certain categories of the API community. And they found that Seattle public schools are in gross violation of civil rights laws. So the roundtable is marshaling their collective efforts to create restorative justice projects around school discipline in high schools across Seattle. So we have representatives from YUR that sit on the Mayor's Social Justice Roundtable and really are taking leadership roles around this effort around addressing discipline and racism and discipline practices. And I guess maybe just the last thing to say around YUIR is that they are doing Know Your Rights with the police and Know Your Rights in schools trainings for other young people across the, not just for young people, for adults as well, across the city. I know this year we have a workshop, a training set up for them at a place called Passage Point, which is a kind of reunification center for women who have been incarcerated, so reunifying with their children. So the idea is that they would come and do the training for both the parents and the young people. And then we'll also be doing the workshop for a project in the city of Seattle called Career Bridge, which is to help primarily African-American men who have felonies to get jobs and to get everything else that they need. So kind of coming in, having that discussion with those brothers around, knowing their rights with the police, as well as, many of them are parents, so understanding their rights in terms of navigating the school systems. Just the other quick bodies of work that we're working on. The Department of Justice also investigated the Seattle Police Department and for their history of racial profiling and brutality against communities of color. And so there has been the formation of what is called the Community Police Commission, which is a body of community members designed to develop recommendations to address institutional practices of the Seattle Police Department. Marcel Purnell, our program associate, sits on that panel and kind of has been tasked with representing the youth voice of the city of Seattle, which is an enormous task, but many of y'all maybe have met Marcel, and those of you who haven't, when you meet him, you will get to see how bright and talented Marcel is. But AFSC has engaged with several police officers who have been involved with some really high-profile incidents that have kind of made Keith Olbermann's Worst People in America segments. And we've been asked by the assistant chief of the Seattle Police Department to engage with some of these officers, and specifically to have them come through an undoing racism process. And what's been amazing for us is that the specific officer, and I don't want to lift up his name because I just don't want to put him in this light at this point, but this specific officer was mandated to come through the undoing racism training the first time, struggled. Then he came back again on his own a second time. Then he came a third time bringing other officers. And the fourth time, he's been bringing other officers and also recommending for many other officers to come through. And then so we've had a couple different officers come through who have kind of been on the negative end of a discipline process, but when they've come through the process, many of them, all of them have said, this has not only been a transformational experience for me as an individual, but every single officer in our police department should come through this workshop around understanding systemic and institutional racism. And many of these officers have said that if I would have had this understanding when I began my profession, I would have done my work in very different ways. So we are working with a cohort of police officers to develop kind of a training that's going to be law enforcement centered, really looking at the history of policing, especially in relationship to poor and communities of color. What has been the basis for the negative relationship that we see today? And what can begin to be done from a law enforcement perspective to really lift oppression off of communities? How can law enforcement begin to engage with our young people in different ways? So we're going to develop that workshop. We're also going to develop a series of youth and police dialogues where young people can come together and really have honest conversation, where both parties, the young people will have been through Freedom School, the police officers will have been through Undoing Racism, so we'll have a common language. Hopefully those police officers will have been through the primary and secondary trauma and brain development training we talked about earlier, so they can have a greater understanding of young people and young people's brain development, and really hopefully begin to build a relationship so every relationship is not negative when our young people come together. And we know that one police officer told me about one of his typical days. He said that he went from a shooting call where his partner was involved with shooting someone. He went to a bank robbery, then he went to a call where there was a parking lot dispute. So how do you manage dealing with high level of trauma to something that often most of us in this room would consider to be pretty petty? So if you can imagine an officer dealing with that, then coming upon some young people who are dealing with the trauma of an education system that's not serving them, racial profiling, poverty, the violence that our young people are dealing with in their community, when those two forces come together, that's a toxic combination. And we have not developed language for both parties to really to understand each other and to engage with each other, hopefully in a way that promotes justice and health. So we want to address that. We're also working with the prosecutor's office in King County around helping them look at different ways in which the prosecutors' practices perpetuate systemic racism, and we're working with the juvenile drug court in the same spirit. And just the last thing I would say is that our long-term vision is to really be a part of a national movement. What I would love is for us to be able to have freedom schools across this country, Youth Undoing Institutional Racism chapters across this country, and for us as AFSC to really kind of ignite a youth movement around jobs, education, and incarceration. Kind of bringing back like the energy that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee had.
The conference has been unmuted.
So I'm done talking now. And I'll just say our primary challenge, and I think there's a challenge that all of us share across the service committee, is resources. I mean, we are constantly requested with our time and our energy in Seattle. People want us to come into schools, want us to do freedom schools in Tacoma, Washington, and Spokane, Washington, all across the region, but we just don't have the capacity to do that. And to meet all of the requests and to engage with all the young people and families that we want to engage with. So our biggest challenge, and like I say, I'm sure that's a challenge for everyone, is the lack of resources. So I'll open this up to questions, conversation, dialogue. I'm going to take a sip of water first. So.
It's exciting to hear all about that. I mean, I met Marcel, and he told me some of the things, but it's incredible. And the whole sort of system analysis is really amazing, as well as the working on the level of moral change. I mean, James Baldwin said the only real change is a moral change, and it seems like really taking out the mindset that creates all of these systems is essential, or they'll keep recreating themselves. And I really, really appreciate that. And I wanted to, as you were talking, I was thinking about like the decimation of public schools in this country, and I had this sort of, and thinking about the sort of neoliberal push to have that happen, and what's involved in that. And I was thinking about it recently, and I was like, it seems as though what's happened is there's a move from the suburbs into the cities, that they're getting gentrified, and that sort of white people want the cities back. Yeah. And I wonder if there's kind of a decimation of the public schools to get people of color to move. And also like the importance of like working with law enforcement, but working with people, decision makers in schools as well, and policy makers around the schools, because it seems such a critical piece of the whole equation.
Yeah. I mean, gentrification is definitely alive and well in Seattle. You know, Lucy, as you bring up your question, it makes me think about Garfield High School in Seattle, which is the historical African-American high school. It's where Jimi Hendrix went to high school, Quincy Jones, Bruce Lee, Brandon Roy, for any of you who are NBA fans. And so if you go into Garfield High School, the central area of Seattle was the area where black people could only live historically in Seattle. It was a red-lined community. But if you go into Seattle High School today in 2013, essentially you will see an apartheid school. If you come downstairs, you will see predominantly African American or students of color in either special education or what is considered regular level classes. If you go upstairs, you will see predominantly 85 to 90% white students in advanced placement classes. So what we're seeing in Seattle is a push of students of color out of the magnet schools that are hosting, imagine here too, and really across the country, right, that are hosting AP programs, spectrum programs, higher level education programs, and pushing students of color further into South King County. So there are definitely attempts to engage with educators around, of course, addressing the racial disparities. But in many ways, folks in our community are saying that we do not trust the Seattle Public School to educate our children, that the only way that the Seattle Public Schools can be successful in educating our children is that if community are really brought to the table and really helping to devise the curriculum, the teaching styles, and the culture of the classroom. And there's also community-based efforts in Seattle to develop community-based educational programs that can be supplemental education for our young people. And it's really interesting, you know, when we think about young people that are either tracked into special education or kicked out of school for discipline reasons, You know, in our Freedom School, we have many of those same children that often, if they're in a mainstream educational environment, would be deemed to be problem children. But we never, ever, ever have a problem with any of these children in our experience. And from our experience, that if we're relating to our young people from a place of respect, from a place of love, from a place of high expectation, and talking about the reality that impacts them, that our children not only want to learn, but have a innate brilliance that's just not being tapped in the mainstream education system.
Can I ask another one?
Sure.
So, I mean, it seems as though reconstructing that, like, or not reconstructing, but doing something that's really that visionary and alternative in terms of schools, like, do you have an analogy? I'm just interested in it because it's so present here, and it seems like so related to incarceration, and so one step on the way. So, and also like that we don't want to reconstruct FDR capitalism, we want something else. So that's connected as well.
Yeah, I have a lot of thoughts about that. You know, one of the other things I want to lift up, we developed a in-school curriculum, kind of a Freedom School, roughly 10-week lesson plan that teachers could take into a school system. But if the educators don't have a working analysis of the material, they're not going to be effective in terms of teaching it. Right. So one of the things that we're working on is to bring educators together, in part to help set up YUR chapters in different schools, but also to bring educators together to begin to understand how to use the curriculum, how to develop their analysis around, again, whether it's capitalism, racism, and to begin to do things differently in their classroom. Our struggle, again, around convening what we want to convene is around resources, so we're kind of looking at different, and I know, Jen, you're on the phone, looking around some different funding opportunities to host this convening, but we think it's important that we have kind of many different kind of practices going on, community-based stuff, working with folks who are in the school, because we know that we can set up as many community-based schools as we want to. Some of our kids are still going to be in the public school system. So we have to kind of have a two-pronged approach in terms of addressing these issues. Any other questions or thoughts? Yes.
Can you say a little bit more about, it's nice to hear about a program that's sort of grounded on ideology. I think sometimes we, as an organization, sort of stay away from our ideology so explicitly. But could you talk a little bit about, developing the curriculum and how that came about, some of your supporters in the community?
The basis of what we do in our work really comes out of the analysis of the People's Institute for Survival and Beyond. From my experience, I have found it to be the most effective analysis, not only in terms of understanding race and racism in the United States, but also in terms of engaging in anti-racist organizing. Earlier on, I mentioned undoing racism principles. So a lot of times when we say anti-racist organizing, people think it's just about organizing against issues of racism, but it's also a methodology and approach in terms of organizing around whatever issue. So if we're organizing around militarism, if we're organizing around gender issues, we believe we should take an anti-racist approach to all of those issues. Because if we don't, then white people will disproportionately benefit. That's one reason. But we also believe the principles allow us to organize in a way that brings humanity to our organizing. So we really are grounded in that experience, that analysis. And of course, popular education and our understanding of popular education, our understanding around the class construct and capitalism in the United States, all of that fits in to our analysis, but our base foundational analysis is the undoing racism analysis, and kind of coming through that experience. Yes.
First, I'd just like to tell you that it's really good to have you here and to hear the work that you do, and it just sounds phenomenal, and I rarely had these opportunities, so I appreciate your visit and everything that you're sharing. about the work that you are doing. I was wondering about the sustainability of some of the alumni. Like, do you have relations, like, you've been doing this for several years, and some of those 16 and 21-year-olds are probably now into their 30s. Do you have a relationship with them? Is there any memorable kind of thing that you keep a watchful eye on? Do they come back and participate in other ways?
I think one of the most beautiful experiences for me is the fact that alumni come back almost every year. So we have alumni that have been coming back for 10, 12 years that have gone to college, started working, but they're still engaged either as mentors for the Youth Undoing Racism, at the very least coming back and taking as much time they can take off during the summer to really be a part of Freedom School. So that's been a beautiful part of the experience. One of the things we've been tasked with this year is to really evaluate how young people stay engaged post-Freedom School. So we know the young people that stay engaged through by engaging directly with our work, but we also know that a lot of young people are doing work on their college campuses or doing work in different communities. I think of a young man who came through the Freedom School, left Freedom School, went to Yale, then became a teacher here in Camden, and has come back to Seattle to really want to talk with us about how he can help to organize a Freedom School to take place in Camden. So we have young people all across the country that have come through our experience that are still doing organizing. But in terms of really capturing it from an evaluative perspective, we haven't done a great job of that, but that's something we're going to work on this year. But anecdotally, there's a deep connection. You're welcome. Anyone else?
Anyone on the phone have any questions or comments?
Well, this is Laura in San Francisco. I just want to say I'm always totally inspired by Dustin. You just, it's really helpful to hear you contextualize it the way you are and to see where it's all leading, and it's just really exciting to be working in the region together on these issues.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I won't tell everybody I paid you to say that.
Your region peeps.
Good job, Laura.
Arthur?
Hey, Dustin, this is Jen, and I'll be looking for my check too, because what I'm going to say is you can obviously see why some of the best fundraising we can do is to get Dustin right with the foundations, because he really lays it out so wonderfully. So, and it is a very exciting program.
Agreed. Arthi has a question, and then I think Patricia, was your hand up in that as well?
Hi, Dustin.
Hey.
I really appreciate the way the Freedom School links in with the Youth Undoing Institutional Racism and gives people who go through the program something kind of continuing, concrete for them to do. And you also talked about the work trying to stop the juvenile detention center. Are the youth involved in that as well, or
Yeah.
and if so, how? Like, what are they doing around that?
So the kind of one of the organizing wings of YUIR is the Project EPIC in the prison industrial complex.
Gotcha.
So that's almost all YUR is involved with that, but it's a multi-generational group as well. So, we have YUR that meets every Thursday, and then every other Thursday, our meeting continues past. So YUR meets 4 to 6, and then we'll stay 6 to 8 for EPIC meetings. So all the youth are involved with that, but we really try to create a multi-generational experience. Even with YUR being centered around the young people, we still try to create a multi-generational experience within YUR as well.
So they're all working on that
Yes.
project.
Yes.
I wanted to give you a chance to talk a little bit more about the point right where you got cut off about national effort at YUIR. One real specific question: are there other AFSC programs that you know of that are using the Freedom School model that are starting to do some of this? But then in general, what would this national effort look like?
So we are working with Maria in our Portland office. We've done kind of a mini Freedom School last year, and we're actually going to do a kind of a mini Freedom School in November, kind of partnering with Portland State University. So we're working there. We know in New Orleans there's a connection between the New Orleans office and the People's Institute around the Freedom School that's taken place there. But in terms of at least how I could envision a national freedom school effort, I would love for us to have freedom schools in every region, in every city that we do work in, and really developing kind of, you know, maybe a similar foundational curriculum, then kind of enhancing that curriculum with, you know, the specific needs of that individual community. And then out of that, developing standing youth groups where we're really developing youth as organizers. And you know, personally, I would love for us to see, because there's so many things that we could organize around. But if we could imagine youth all across this country organizing again around jobs, education, and ending mass incarceration, or, you know, which is really kind of a updated version of the triplets of oppression that Dr. King talked about: racism, militarism, and poverty. I imagine that we could be at the forefront of igniting a serious youth movement, a collected and connected youth movement across this country. You know, there's a lot of amazing organizing going on around the country, but in many ways we're not connected in the ways that we need to be. So I can imagine us having a national youth council out of the different chapters around the country that would come together and really formulate ideas and share learnings and strategies with each other, and really kind of helping young people take the forefront of this movement and bringing new, exciting ideas to the movement, using social media, using all the tools that our young people know about in ways that many of us aren't as adept at. So I think there's possibility for us to really do something special. And again, you know, when we think about just the kind of what we laid out here on the board and the political, social environment in which we're engaging and where it looks like we're moving as a country, we better be developing young people to address the systemic issues impacting us, or we're going to be in a world of trouble.
I know you mentioned that in the schools that 90% of the youth are color. Is there a goal to have that be less than that and more white people come in, so to change their attitude? Or is that, I mean, is that a goal, or I'm not sure.
Well, what I would say is that our goal has been to primarily serve youth of color, but we don't have any hard and fast numbers around that. But we're open to doing freedom school. We want everybody to get this analysis. We want everyone to get this analysis. So I would say yes, that is a goal, but often we have to make sure that we're lifting up the needs of youth of color because they have been the least served in our society and are getting the brunt of all these issues that we're talking about.
So is the message, I guess I'm asking, is the message getting across then to the youth of, you know, white youth, so that they can change their mindset to, you know, get the message even to the, you know, white population as well?
I think the white youth that come through our freedom school process and that are part of YUIR are doing, definitely get it. They're definitely working hard to get their peers into freedom school and into YUIR. There is a kind of an adult organizing group in Seattle called European Descent, and it's a group of white, anti-racist white folks who are come together specifically at times just as white folks. And one of the challenges we have put to them is that we need you to organize more young white people. We need you to go into, because, you know, typically, I don't know how it plays out here in Philadelphia, but I imagine somewhat similar. You kind of have a typical, the same class, the same highly educated, liberal-esque folks, but these folks are not speaking a language that can engage working class white people. They're not speaking in a language that can engage working class white students. And we know that if anti-racist white people aren't engaging them, we know who is engaging those folks. And it's typically Tea Party folks and the right-wing folks. So we've been pushing our allies in European descent. I hate that term allies, but we're pushing the folks in European descent to really engage in the white community and bring us more white students. Bring more white students to the table and white families to the table. Because we know this movement, we can't change this country with just people of color.